Good afternoon. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Willie Prado, Dean of the Graduate School and Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs here at the University of Miami. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you to our third annual Research Symposium. The Graduate School started this tradition soon after I became Dean of the Graduate School because I felt that we, as an institution, were missing a key opportunity to showcase the research and scholarship of our talented graduate students and postdoctoral fellows in one single forum under one umbrella. This year in particular, it is important that we recognize the achievements of our graduate students and our postdoctoral fellows because despite the stress, the fear, the uncertainty, the halt of research, scholarship, performances, and even the losses, you all have continued and advanced your programs of research and scholarship. Some of the innovative and impactful research that we will hear about today from our 70 presenters, more than we've ever had, is on the severity of symptom outcomes of COVID-19 on youth with autism, vaccine hesitancy, climate and resilience, and the positive effects of music therapy. Bottom line, you're in for a day of learning, networking, despite the virtual format, and very provocative conversations. In addition to thanking you, our presenters, for your tenacity and resilience, I would also like to thank the Graduate Student Association and the Postdoc Association, who have been great partners in helping the graduate school team prepare for this virtual event. So thank you, and thank you. I would also like to recognize Laura Ramos from the graduate school, who has been the creative mastermind and the implementer of today's event. Laura, we really appreciate all you do. Finally, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the almost 250 faculty, students, postdocs, and staff who have registered for the event and are watching us virtually. I promise this will be a great afternoon. And talking about great afternoons, this great afternoon starts with our keynote speaker, Dr. Erin Kobetz. A public health scientist by training, Dr. Kobetz is also our Vice Provost for Research and one of the Associate Directors of our NCI-accredited Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center. I have known Dr. Kobetz since I arrived on the faculty at the University of Miami about 14 years ago. I recall meeting her back then, and I thought to myself, boy, would I love to work with her and have her as my colleague. I am grateful that I have had the opportunity to work with her as a public health scientist, and more recently, as one of my fellow provosts. However, what I am most proud of is that I am able to call her my friend. And with that said, I'd like to welcome and thank Dr. Erin Kobetz. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you, Willie. I'm so touched by that introduction. I don't know if I'm going to be able to gather myself to give the talk. I'm trying to share my slides. Dean Prado didn't give me a ton of boundaries for how I should organize this keynote address. And so I tried to think about what I would want to hear when I was a graduate student, which is now many, many years ago. And I thought that maybe looking back over the course of my career at the University of Miami and sharing with you some of the key lessons learned might be an interesting place to start. So some of you may know a little bit about my research. It is grounded in public health, as Dean Prado suggested, but let me orient you a little bit because many of the lessons that I'm going to share were actually learned in Little Haiti, which was in many ways the genesis of where my work went and who I ultimately hope to become. So I was recruited to the University of Miami in 2004, right after completing my PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I was recruited by the then Cancer Center director, a man named Dr. Jerry Goodwin, who I still have so much gratitude for because he took a chance on me. As many of you may be thinking about your own career trajectories, I'm sure those of you who are PhDs, certainly those in disciplines like public health or even basic scientists, are likely recognizing the necessity of a postdoc. I was hired into a faculty role without doing one. And the reason being is that Jerry wanted me to create a program in cancer disparity, which was sort of my life goal, particularly because he was asking me to do that in Miami, which is where I'm a native. And what Jerry hoped I could do was really start cultivating interdisciplinary collaboration at Sylvester around persistent cancer disparity within our catchment area, which is South Florida, the four-county region from Monroe in the south to Palm Beach at the north. And I was naive and perhaps a little too egotistical to recognize that this was a really daunting task for somebody just finishing a PhD, but I couldn't be undeterred. And so what I started to do, which is what I think any good public health practitioner would do, is I started mapping the distribution of different cancer types across the Miami metropolitan area. I was particularly interested in cervical cancer because I consider that to be an objective marker of cancer disparity. When women have equitable access to the formal healthcare system, they don't develop, let alone die of cervical cancer. And in my mapping exercise, what I identified was an area highlighted on the map here where there was 4 times higher incidence of cervical cancer than had been reported for the rest of Florida, the United States as a whole, and really rivaled what had been observed in the developing world. And so I was curious. The beautiful thing about maps is that you can focus in on cross streets, get in your car and drive, and that's exactly what I did. I actually thought over and over as I was driving to this location that I might be entering swampland. I was pretty convinced that what I found was statistical artifact and that it really represented that there were too few women living within this area to actually constitute a meaningful cancer disparity or a real cancer disparity. But my assumption was wrong because I quickly realized that I was in the ethnic enclave known as Little Haiti. The only reason that I knew that this was Little Haiti, I'm embarrassed to admit even today, is because of the predominance of signs that were in a language other than English or Spanish. So what I found is that in Little Haiti, the rate of cervical cancer was about 38 per 100,000, which again is 4 times higher than anywhere else in the United States. And I really saw this as an opportunity and obligation. So one of the things that I think is fundamental about public health as a discipline is that many of us in the field, see the mission of public health to not just uncover interesting variability in disease outcome, but also to figure out necessary strategies by which to intervene upon that variability to advance equity. And so in thinking about the first lesson that I learned, and probably the one that's most important to me even to this day, it's to know your why. So after I found out I was in Little Haiti, I got back into my car, drove to the School of Medicine, and excitedly tried to engage senior colleagues in a dialogue about the potential of doing meaningful translational research to understand and address this excess cervical cancer disparity in Little Haiti. And what I encountered was pretty significant reluctance. Many of these senior colleagues were trying to dissuade me from pursuing this line of inquiry. They felt that were I to do so, that it would really affect my professional growth and my tenurability. And I was in this weird situation where I wasn't really sure what to do, to trust my intuition or to listen to senior colleagues who had far more practical experience within the world of academia and who were advising me that this data that I found was somewhat of a Pandora's box, and were I to pursue understanding the complex etiology of what accounted for that disparity, that I was basically working at myself out of a job. But the reason I got into public health and the reason that I remain passionate about it even to this day is that I see my research as a vehicle for social justice and as a way to advance health equity. And so I stayed true to my why. And despite this input from senior faculty who were intimately connected to my career success and even my reappointment, I decided not to turn my back on that data discovery and to try to engage community leaders in a collaborative process by which we could pursue science and scholarship that would help me better appreciate what caused that disparity and, more importantly, what to do about it. So I wish I could tell you that when I went back to Little Haiti that I was met with open arms. I wasn't. And I think this leads me to my second lesson, which is know what you don't know. So I was straight out of a PhD, right? Most of my friends had opted not to go into academia or were doing really prestigious postdocs. I was already faculty. And I felt like I came from an esteemed institution with this multidisciplinary background, that I had worked with, some of the biggest leaders in my field, and I knew a lot. What I didn't know, and I came to appreciate in probably a harsher way than I could have ever anticipated, was how much I actually didn't know. And I say to my teams even now that they should always know what they don't know. Because by acknowledging sort of those gaps in your experience, your expertise and knowledge, it provides an opportunity not only for collaboration, but also for self and professional improvement. So what I did was I went back to Little Haiti. I had identified the names of a number of community-based organizations on probably AOL, because I don't think Google existed back then. And I started to knock on the doors of the organizations that I had identified. And I would say to them in my white lab coat, "Hi, I'm Erin Kobetz. I'm from the University of Miami. I'm a doctor, and I want to do research with you to understand why women in Little Haiti are developing cervical cancer in excess numbers." Besides the fact that that was a mouthful, I didn't recognize that what I was doing was creating a history for which Little Haiti and many Little Haiti residents felt extraordinarily skeptical and distrustful, both of research and researchers affiliated with the University of Miami. So I didn't know what I didn't know. I hadn't done my history. I hadn't put on my anthropologic hat to appreciate that during the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, Haitian ancestry was erroneously labeled as a risk factor for transmission by the Centers for Disease Control. And the research that substantiated an increased prevalence of what was then called gay-related infectious disease within the Haitian community very much led to the legitimized discrimination of a group of people who were already living on the margins. Research was a dirty word. And worse than it being a dirty word, the community's experience with research went beyond this discrimination to something that I call the parachute effect. So the researchers who did that work never came back to the community to share their findings, nor to proactively engage community leaders in a conversation about what potentially they might be able to do to lower the risk of infection transmission and or navigate the additional challenges imposed by the media. And this was a very, very important lesson. So what I came to realize was that if I wanted to work in Little Haiti, understanding the excess burden of cervical cancer, that I was going to have to take the epistemology of epidemiology and turn it on its head. So epidemiology is a positivist, draws from a positive epistemology. There is a single objective truth that very good epidemiologists get closer to approximating through rigorous and consistent measurement. But what I came to realize was that in Little Haiti is that if I wanted to be successful, I was going to sort of have to abandon some of the fundamental expectations of my discipline and engage in a methodology for which I had limited formal training, but was becoming pretty popular because it bridged the chasm between researcher and researched. And this was community-based participatory research. And community-based participatory research has its roots in anthropology and sociology. There are many different terms to describe it, but when I was starting out about 16 years ago, it was very nascent within both public health and medicine, given their adherence to a positivist epistemology. But I knew that in order to work in Little Haiti, I couldn't work in Little Haiti, I had to work with Little Haiti. And so community-based participatory research became a really important methodology by which to work collaboratively with the community to help dissuade some of the historical skepticism that existed within Little Haiti around research and the benefits to community health and well-being. And so what CBPR does, and I think many of you likely know this, is that it invites community members to be collaborators in the research throughout the entire research continuum, from the conceptualization of the idea to the dissemination of findings. And by working together in this fashion, what it does is it marries the academic expertise of somebody like myself with the local experience of community members. And together we're better poised to ask questions that have construct and cultural validity, and also circumvent challenges to data collection that exist in many communities like Little Haiti, for which research was a dirty word. Now, the reason why I believe community-based participatory research is so important is because of this slide. And well, in part because of this slide, because the other reason it's really important is that when you do CBPR, you also make a substantive financial investment within the community. And so 50% of my grant dollars have always gone to community partners in Little Haiti or other communities in which I'm working, to ensure that as part of the work that we're building necessary capacity and competency within the community to support research that can be pursued by the community itself, independent from a researcher such as myself. The other reason that I believe that community-based participatory research matters is because the significance of community input allows us to identify those conditions that affect the community at large, regardless of somebody's individual propensity for disease. So what does this mean? So this slide is from Jeffrey Rose, who was a physician in the UK who wrote this book called Paradox of Prevention. And it's actually this slide and that book which forced me into public health and away from medicine. What Rose so eloquently argues within this text is that medicine and public health need to achieve their independent identities. He was making a critique on modern day public health, saying that it had become too closely connected to academic medicine and was failing to create opportunities to advance disease prevention and health promotion for broad communities, but was rather focusing on high-risk individuals. So here in this slide, you see this normal distribution. At the tail end are individuals with extreme systolic blood pressure. These are individuals who really need medical intervention in order to prevent a hemorrhagic stroke. And what Rose was arguing was that it's not the goal of public health to take care of those high-risk individuals. Rather, the goal of public health is to shift the distribution back so that you can create maximal opportunity for most people to be healthy. Now, when he's talking about those conditions, what he's really talking about are social, cultural, and other determinants that exist on the level above the individual. And one of the best ways to appreciate those determinants is to speak to community members who are better poised from their lived experience to help characterize the very impediments that preclude their ability to achieve health than any academic text. So, speaking of, lesson number 4 is that truth is a social construct. What does this mean? So I've spent time in many communities, both in the United States and abroad. And even though somebody like me is the wife of a physician and the daughter of a physician and grew up thinking of germ theory as truth, that's not universal. And this was one of the most eye-opening lessons that I learned early in Little Haiti. So what I came to recognize in Little Haiti was that there was this pluralistic understanding of health and disease promotion that drew both from germ theory as well as humoral theory, which is a lay interpretation of disease etiology that's popular in Haiti and the Caribbean at large. And what humoral theory speaks to is to a need to achieve balance or homeostasis in bodily humors. It actually dates back to Hippocrates. So when I was asking women in Little Haiti, do you practice cancer prevention? They were telling me yes, thinking that I was talking about humoral theory and teas and tinctures and baths that helped actualize that homeostasis in their bodily humors. And I was thinking that they meant they got a pap smear. Well, having an appreciation for this idea that not everybody understood healthcare or appreciated healthcare encounters from the same cultural lens was really important. And my community members were the best teachers, because when I started in Little Haiti, it was a medically underserved area, which meant that the federal government had decided that there was a shortage of primary care providers available to meet the preventive care needs of the community at large. What that basically translated to was that there was a lack of places where women could go to get pap smears, which at the time was the gold standard for cervical cancer prevention. So I felt certain that the best thing that I could do was to open a free clinic where women could come and get pap smears on an annual basis which was then the interval recommended by the United States Preventive Services Task Force. So grateful that I worked with community partners who told me that if I built it, they wouldn't come. And the reason being is part this pluralistic understanding in health and disease promotion, but also other things that there was no way that I could easily appreciate just by looking at academic literature. So in my mind, the top 3 things are, in Creole, there's not a word for cervix. Cancer itself is cancer, which means that it's sort of borrowed from English, but cervix translates to colmatrice, which basically means the bottle of the funnel or womb, which is where it is located anatomically. But without having a specific word, it's very hard to give meaningful significance to a disease that originates in a place that people don't really readily understand because they have no word to describe or any words to articulate its anatomical function. The other thing that I came to learn is that many women in Little Haiti were super averse to the notion of a cervical exam. The reason being is that they didn't like the speculum. Now, no woman who undergoes routine cervical cancer screening endorses the speculum as comfortable, desirable, or even, not awkward. But in Little Haiti, it was far more complex than that. So what women were speaking of were 2 things. One, they believed when the speculum was in the vagina that it allowed for gas or gauze, which was an amorphous etiologic factor, to sort of enter and get trapped within the womb. And the problem with this is that we were asking them to do something that we knew from literature and from evidence-based practice reduced the likelihood of cervical cancer onset and progression, but they saw it as a risk factor for disease in and of itself. Now, the other thing that was really important about the speculum is that women believed that it interrupted the tone or rigidity of their vagina in such a way that they were no longer sexually desirable to their male partners on whom they were economically dependent. And this was far more of a complex issue than I had any ability to navigate, even my own personal life, gendered politics. But I knew that what it meant was that I was going to have to come up with a different strategy for cervical cancer prevention and early detection than the pap smear if I wanted to move the dial on cancer disparity in Little Haiti. So that brings me to lesson 5, which is look for inspiration in unlikely places and unlikely people. So I actually was working with a really kick-ass graduate student at the time. I mean, we were basically contemporaries, if you want to know the truth. I think I was like 3 to 4 years her senior because I was really young when I started off at the University of Miami. And one day she hurriedly rushed into my office. She had a copy of the book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, and she had dog-eared it, and she throws it open on my desk and she says, "Read this." And in the book, there's reference to something known as self-sampling or cervical self-sampling. And what cervical self-sampling allows is for a woman to self-collect cervical cells or vaginal cells in the privacy of her own home, thereby circumventing cultural, access, and structural barriers to cervical cancer prevention. And so the student looks at me and she says, "Do you think this is like real?" And I say, "I don't know." We go to PubMed. And as luck would have it, we find that there are a number of recently published peer-reviewed articles that are substantiating the effectiveness of self-sampling for detection of HPV, which is the principal cause of cervical cancer. Now, there's still 2 gaps. One, most of the research that we're reading are large trials that are being done in academic medical centers where people already have access to the formal healthcare system. And in my mind, that's a failure of translation. If self-samplers are being used within a healthcare context, they're not achieving their intended impact. The self-sampler needed to go beyond the walls of the ivory tower into communities that were characterized by cervical cancer screening underutilization and cervical cancer incidence. So then we go to the community and we say to the community, "What do you think about this idea?" And they say, "We think women will like it, but it can't be provided in a clinical setting. You still shouldn't open a clinic. You need to pair the self-sampler with community health workers who are indigenous to Little Haiti, who know the norms, language, and customs, and can appropriately broach a complex and sensitive conversation like cervical cancer prevention within their social networks appropriately. And I have to tell you, I was not really open to the suggestion at the time, but I'm so grateful for the foresight of my community partners, the knowledge that they had about the community, and this idea that if we paired the self-sampler with community health workers, that we would get more traction and uptake. And in fact, we became the first group in the United States to ever pair a self-sampler with a community health worker. And that very idea that was brought to me by a graduate student has been in some way or other the focus of my science for the past 16 years. So this is the next unlikely person that I want to introduce you to. So this is the same person. This is Lieutenant Butch Smith. Butch was a firefighter in Palm Beach County. And when he was 43 years old, he was diagnosed with stage 4 multiple myeloma and given a very short time to live. Now, Butch came into my life through his very good friend and colleague, Sam Eden, who was a battalion chief in Palm Beach County Fire Rescue, and who was so moved by Butch's cancer experience that he and Butch collectively determined that Butch's life needed to represent more than the disease to which he would ultimately succumb. And they started a very important, difficult conversation about issue of cancer in the fire service. So firefighters tend to think that they're invincible. Butch definitely did. He was a hulk of a man, 6'5", probably when he was healthy, like close to 275 pounds of muscle. He was the kind of caricature of a firefighter that you would find in cartoon books who could like carry 10 children underneath his 2 arms. And then cancer stopped him dead in the tracks. And what Butch's diagnosis made Butch and Sam realize was that Butch's experience wasn't Butch's alone, that there were many other firefighters that they knew who, like Butch, had been diagnosed with these aggressive cancers early on. And they started a conversation and created an organization called FACE, Facing Firefighters Against Our Cancer Epidemic. And FACE reached out to me. So I got a phone call in my office from Sam and another FACE member who tried to compel me to work with them to understand why cancer was a problem within the fire service. There had been sketchy data historically that suggested that there was something about this occupation that increased the risk of cancer. And they thought that science and scholarship were the answer, because if they could figure out why, then we could figure out what to do about it. And I have to tell you that I really was not enthusiastic about this work at all. And the reason I wasn't enthusiastic is I think I had a very limited perspective about what cancer disparity was. And in my mind, Butch and firefighters didn't reflect that definition. But how limited and myopic of me, because here was a group of people who, despite having access to the formal healthcare system, and many of them being healthcare advocates and practitioners themselves, were dying of a disease based primarily on their occupation and occupational exposures. And so when you meet firefighters, they're not to be dissuaded. They were tenacious. They were persistent. And eventually I decided that I was going to give it a go. I was going to hear them out and figure out how I could blow them off. But I didn't and I couldn't. And I'm extraordinarily glad that I made a different choice, because the work that I do with firefighters is actually the greatest privilege of my career. And the reason being is because of lesson learned number 6, which is that team science and scholarship is the best science and scholarship. The firefighters knew how to reach out to me. They say because they had read about my work in Little Haiti. I think they likely Googled Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, cancer prevention, and I was the picture that came up. But either way, they got to me, and through me, they got to 30, 40 other scientists at the University of Miami and scholars who worked from bench to communications to epidemiology to try to figure out what was causing the excess risk of cancer in the fire service. Together, we created something called the Firefighter Cancer Initiative, and it's in its 7th year. It's in large part supported by an appropriation from the state of Florida, but much of our work has been extraordinarily successful, and we've been able to leverage the preliminary data that we collect using state of Florida resources to draw down other research grants that allow us to extend our work and our impact. And so I want to really underscore that working across disciplinary boundaries is essential, particularly in today's world, where many of us walk into science and scholarship with a personal commitment to make progress on understanding a persistent global challenge. Something like cancer disparity, whether it be in Little Haiti or the fire service, is not a finish line that I am ever going to cross alone. It's a very complex problem with multifactorial determinants that require the time, talent, and know-how of scientists, scholars, and firefighters working collaboratively, marrying their respective expertise together in a way that allows us to not only ask compelling questions, but also to act on those questions to drive necessary change. And so, number 7 is keep your eyes on the prize, which is one of the most powerful parts of the work that we've done with firefighters, is that we didn't just generate new knowledge. We use that knowledge to translate it into actionable opportunity to improve health in measurable ways. So let me give you a couple of examples. So early on, Alberto Caban-Martinez, who is one of my faculty colleagues helping lead the Firefighter Cancer Initiative, did an investigation where he was able to uphold that when firefighters wore their bunker gear from an active fire back to the cab of their truck and then to their fire station, only then removing the bunker gear and putting it in their personal vehicle to take home to wash in their washing machines, that there was a trail of carcinogens that followed them. And the reason why this matters is that cancer tends not to occur because of a one-time exposure. It tends to be a repeated, sustained exposure over many years and many fires. So when the firefighters were wearing that bunker gear into the cab of the car, they were shedding those carcinogens. So when they would get into it at another point, they were re-exposing themselves to that very carcinogen, but probably in even greater amounts. And so this research, which seems so fundamental and in many ways simple, was actually extraordinarily profound, because what it led to was a quick way to reduce that repeated exposure. So together with firefighters, we came up with these decon kits, which you see here on the screen. These are cheap kits that are basically put together with materials from either Home Depot, Lowe's, CVS, Publix, you name it. And they allow firefighters to safely decontaminate right after a fire, wrapping up their bunker gear, keeping it separate from the cab of the truck. And we disseminated almost 5,000 of these throughout the state of Florida, ensuring that our research wasn't just published in a high impact peer-reviewed journal, but actually translated to something practical that firefighters use every single day. And next time you drive by a fire station, peek your eyes in. You're certain to find one of these kits. Now, probably the proudest thing that I would think my colleagues and I accomplished is cancer coverage. So what this means is that firefighters for many years were trying to get the Florida legislature to recognize that cancer was an occupational disability, and thereby the firefighters themselves needed to have access to certain benefits once diagnosed with cancer that would allow them to continue to bring home an income so that their family wouldn't be bankrupted by their cancer diagnosis. Due to the advocacy of the firefighters, armed with the data that we did as part of the Firefighter Cancer Initiative, cancer coverage or presumption was actually passed. And now firefighters throughout the state of Florida, when diagnosed with cancer, have access to those very benefits that they had been fighting so long to achieve. Now, my number one lesson is my last lesson, but it's probably tied closely to my number one lesson, know your why, is don't ever forget that passion fuels purpose. And so at the heart of everything that I've done scientifically has been this personal commitment to being a champion for health equity and being willing to represent the conversation about health equity with people and in spaces where it hadn't traditionally been on the table. And so here you see Sylvester's Game Changer, which might be one of my proudest accomplishments over the course of my career. And we actually have 3 Game Changer vehicles, and they go into medically underserved communities like Little Haiti and bring evidence-based practices like HPV self-sampling to community members who would otherwise be disenfranchised from cancer education and cancer prevention. And so I believe really strongly that the reason that I've been able to drive the change with something like the Game Changer is because at the forefront of what I was doing was my personal commitment to this idea of being an equity champion. And that might not be what drives you, but don't forget what drives you. It's very easy within the rigmarole of everyday life and academia and the lack of balance that all of us try to navigate personally, professionally, and otherwise, to lose sight of why you started doing this in the first place. I'm asking you to never forget, because even now in my role as Vice Provost, that passion is at the forefront of the decisions I make as I try to bring interdisciplinary collaboration across the university to extend our impact, to translate beyond our boundaries and borders, to ultimately benefit South Florida. And so my closing lessons learned really come from my early days in Little Haiti, but something that I hold close to my heart even now. And I hope that my colleagues and collaborators will say that I've stayed true to these lessons and that I also model them, not just for our graduate students, but also within my personal circles as well. So be a good listener and practice humility. Be transparent about your interests and have ongoing open dialogue about the expectations of collaboration. It's really important not to promise more than you can accomplish, to be very forthright that your goal is to do research and to have certain research output that's extraordinarily important for your career, but may not resonate with the priorities of a community. It's very hard once trust is broken to reestablish it. And so what I always say to my students who are working in diverse communities is to never lose sight of the fact that it's always better to be honest at the forefront, so you set the expectations and foundations for collaboration around candor and transparency. Be transparent, tenacious. Change is slow and often, not sometimes, often a very painful process. And don't ever forget that you're an outsider. So there have been many times in my career, both with the firefighters who I do live burns with and run in bunker gear with, and in Little Haiti, where because I work so closely with these communities that I sometimes forget that I'm not a part of them. It's good to have an outside stance because it gives you the possibility to reflect on yourself, to understand the dissonance that exists between your research and scholarship goals and the needs of the community, and also to be able to meaningfully evaluate the progress that you've made and the potential that still exists be uncovered. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much, Erin. A million thanks to Dr. Kobetz. I appreciate you doing this despite the very, very busy schedule that you carry. And I think everyone knows why we asked you to be the keynote speaker this afternoon after that wonderful presentation with very good advice for our graduate students and our postdocs. And I should say that practice humility is my last slide in my own career lessons learned slide deck. So see a couple of students who I presented this to, and they will attest to this. With that said, we have a few minutes. If you have 5 more minutes for a couple of questions. I know Laura's going to come back on, and she is managing the chat. So Laura? I think, Laura, you're on. We can't hear or see you.
Yep, I'm here. We'll be monitoring the chat for any questions. Please submit your questions for Dr. Kobetz via the chat. I'll read these out to you as they come in if we get any.
Okay.
Happy to start with one. Others chime in for questions. So Dr. Kobetz, tell us how you manage, for those graduate students and postdocs who are interested in an academic career and being involved in research, but who also have an interest in administration and in leadership. I wonder if you can give them some advice as to how to manage it all, and what has your experience been like?
So I never thought I'd become an administrator. I should probably say that, honestly. That's occurred, I think, as a function of happenstance. And what often occurs in academia is if you get really good at your science, people also assume that you're really good at being an administrator. In the cancer space, I think it occurred more naturally. I wanted to build sustainable research programs that extended beyond my work and brought other expertise to ensure that our impact was broader than what I was just conceptualizing. The Vice Provost for Research and Scholarship still kind of makes me pause. But, one of the things that I believe is really beautiful about having these 2 different perspectives is that I have to be able to do research and scholarship because it legitimizes me as the Vice Provost for Research and Scholarship, right? Like if I wasn't doing this, what kind of credibility would I have to our university community? How would I know what people were encountering in terms of challenges regarding to grant submissions or getting fundable scores or liftoff of new research projects? I would have no idea. And the other thing that's really important about continuing to do research is that it really represents, I think, why we started off in the field. And if administration weren't to work out or I were to get tired of it, I have the opportunity to go back to my scholarship. And so I think as you take on administrative roles, that's awesome, but don't ever lose sight of what got you into those administrative roles. And then I would also say that my science has taught me a lot about how to be a really good administrator, namely that I do teamwork. And I think in order to be a good administrator, you have to surround yourself with groups of people. You need to be able to work across disciplinary boundaries. You have to engage diverse faculty, staff, students, postdocs, and figure out what the common threads are and then how to act on them in a way that reflects common purpose and shared opportunity.
Great, thank you. Laura, I don't know if there's any questions in the chat.
Yep, there is. How does your position at UM help you access funding for these community programs? And do you have someone on your team that specializes in this area, or is it a skill you developed through your education and or experience? This is from attendee Emily Lambert.
Hey, Emily, that's a great question. So my position at UM, I don't think helps me find the funding, though I hope my position at UM helps other people such as you find funding opportunities. You know, one of the things that I'm trying to establish as the Vice Provost for Research and Scholarship is a real focus on research development. And what that means is really ensuring that there is adequate resources to identify funding opportunities that meet or reflect the expertise of individual faculty, staff, students, or groups of them together, and to figure out how to successfully support application submission so that we can receive those dollars and not only advance our own science and scholarship, but also those of communities. Every week, both me and I think Dean Prado send out notices about different funding opportunities, and I still pay really close attention to those, Emily, so that I can figure out when there's a funding opportunity that resonates with my expertise and priorities, and can figure out how to best apply for it, what partners to bring to the table from the community and university, so that we can be most successful in securing those grants to advance our research agenda.
Perfect. Any other questions from the chat?
Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you once again, Dr. Kobetz. We really appreciate it. Laura, I don't know if you
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll continue with the 2 p.m. TED Talk starting at 5 minutes.